All right, so we're live. Phil, you want to take us away today?
Yeah, we thought we would do this to kind of liven up and loosen things up and put a show together. And I've got a guest who is going to chime in from time to time. It's Catherine Courier, who is head of the library system at the UW 2-year campus at Rice Lake. And we're just going to kind of go over some of her ideas and recognition and some of the experience she has had reading and teaching science fiction. And I'm going to talk about some of that myself. But I'm going to try to show how sometimes with art and literature, you can express a really complicated idea that you might have to fill a whole hard drive up with and you wouldn't get anywhere. Now, I borrowed one of your images from our discussions where you said the world is a burning dumpster. And I thought, well, I like that. And so the implied thing is that you're not going to be dumpster diving in a burning dumpster. But then I thought of it and I thought, well, what the world, Brock, the world is a burning dumpster out of which springs a fiery phoenix. And the phoenix is the mythical creature that burns itself to the ashes every 500 years to spring anew, more resplendent and beautiful. So maybe we can think about science fiction in both those terms. I want to talk about another thing about science fiction. Uh, this isn't the first science fiction rodeo I've been to. I'm founder of a major science fiction convention, member of International Conference on Fantastic and the Art. If you go to my blog, you'll see a long list of qualifications and academic publications and such. But that's kind of a cold, icy world, to be honest with you. Bunch of people sitting in a room talking about books they read. It can be sometimes it'll be a magic moment where everyone sort of hits and you have a conversation. But I'm going to start with one something that happened to me. Oh, I guess about 6 years ago. My wife is retired technical services manager for UW Eau Claire and collection development librarian. And she also has a PhD in comparative literature and teaches in the honors program and sometimes in women's study. And so she's had quite a background herself, and I've helped her with some of the courses. But I had this experience when the things were, this is really strange. Science fiction and chess and Eau Claire appeared almost simultaneously at the same time. And there was in 2006 to 2007, there were very few people playing chess at UW Eau Claire. So I was easily really the best player there because there was just nobody else to play. But there were a couple of lonely guys sitting in the corner of the student unit. One of them's name is Theo Howard, and if he picks this up, he'll get a mention. And he was a pretty good art student and a horrible chess player, absolutely horrible. And I said, "Is this the best you guys got?" And so after insulting them both, I took the campus bus home. And I saw this guy, his name is Phil Koblis. He's Greek, and he was the editor of a campus magazine called The Flip Side. And I saw him I was taking the last bus home, and it was empty from the student union, and it would stop at all the bars on Water Street to pick people up. And all of a sudden I saw a book in his back pocket. And the title of the book was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. And I looked at him and said, "What's your name?" And he said, "My name's Phil Koblis." And I and I'm proud to meet you. and this is the first sign of intelligent life I've seen up here. And he said, well, we edit this campus magazine. And I said, well, I'll give you some poems then. I don't care what you do with them. You can use them for toilet paper for all I care. And so they ran my poems, and they said, you got some more? And I said, I got some stories and some articles. And they said, well, give them to us. So for 2 years, I was kind of like the writer in residence for the Flipside magazine. And while this is happening, all these connections start to be made. And I think really, if you can think of science fiction as a connecting matrix, then you can get an idea of the way you might pick up an idea or think of something. And I can go back. My my first experience with science fiction was on the radio, and we didn't have a television, so we would actually sit in the 50s, in the early 50s. My mother and father and brother and I used to sit around and listen to science fiction on the radio. And I remember two shows that really, really grabbed me. And one of them was called The Cruel Equation. And I think it was by a guy named Sidmouth. And the idea was that in the story, there's a huge ethical problem. And I speak to this huge ethical problem because science fiction was a free press where you could discuss ethical problems as if they were real and mattered. So this is a story about a planet that's suffering from a plague, and they have to bring vaccine to the plague to the planet, and they only have so much room and space on the rocket. And what has happened is one of the sisters of one of the people down on the planet stowaways, and you can't land with her on the planet. What do you do? Well, her last words as she's being put into the airlock and dumped into space is, what did I do? I didn't do anything to anybody. And so you have a bunch of 9 and 10-year-old boys trying to think, well, what could you throw overboard? Could you throw out the bathtub? I want to save that girl. What can we do to get a seat on the lifeboat for somebody that deserves one, but may have to die for everybody else? And that's the kind of stuff, that's the sort of way that I wish we could teach ethical problems so that they were in a real situation and you might actually face something that was important. Because I have taken meta ethics and philosophy, and I get the same old tired things, and I get the wheelchair on what is the one about? I don't know how it ends up, but a wheelchair gets thrown overboard or something like that, and somehow that solves the problem. And we ask, well, should Plato should oh no, who took the poison? That was Socrates, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I took Greek philosophy, and so I had to deal with the problem of the trial of Socrates. And what should he do? He's condemned to death. Should he accept the laws of the country he lives in and drink the poison hemlock? So I wrote a screenplay called Socrates Jailbreak. It wasn't very well received. And one of the reasons he couldn't get away is he escaped, in my version, he escapes in the galley, but a galley is rolled by galley slaves. And the galley slaves would just as soon he has to take the poison. And see, that's the whole thing about most philosophy. And we're going to get into some philosophy that isn't like that, is that it distances itself from necessity. And so you get to talk philosophy in kind of almost like a bubble, one of those kind of bubble. You know what I mean? Where you get to talk as if nothing's going to happen, and it's all speculative. Now, I'm kind of talked quite a while, and can you think of any science fiction, that might fit in with what we're talking about, where we work on big ideas, like big ideas that you might be interested in, or you might maybe, if a smart, you're trying to put together a book discussion group now.
Well, like the impact of language, how it intersects with society and social mores. Um, you've got the impact of how language is wielded in The Handmaid's Tale and how it's used in native tongue.
Mhm.
Um, how everything can change with Babel 17.
Mhm.
So language is one, and then you've got empathy. And you look at, alien contact and how are the aliens, cute and furry, or are they saurian, or are they, reptilian or insects, and how that changes the way they're viewed because we have all these prejudices built up on our planet about how we think about those things.
I wanna recommend a classic science fiction author, H.G. Wells,
Oh, yes.
and he was he he lived from 1866 to 1940, and he's probably most famous in America for the radio play War of the Worlds, where Mars invades Earth. But he also wrote the novella, which takes the British Empire at its absolute peak. It's the most powerful geopolitical force in the world, and it's brought to its knees by super technologically powerful aliens that have ray guns and big walking tripods that just uh, disintegrate anything that they point themselves at. And the thing that makes this story so powerful is that in the end, it's not it's not the great empires that vanquish the aliens. It's the fact that they can't survive the germs that are on Earth. So, so the fact that it's the microbes that do the aliens in. Now, one of the things you'll see with War of the Worlds, this is pretty interesting actually. H.G. Wells was a scientist, a hard materialist, uh, not exactly an atheist, but he was open to the question. So in his version of War of the Worlds, it's just the bacteria that kill the aliens. But in the movie version made in 1953, you see all of the concepts of the movies visualized, the U.S. Army blown to pieces. We're at about the end of the world, and the aliens start dropping over. And you get inside of a church, and a sanctimonious voice is saying, "And isn't it wonderful how the aliens are destroyed not by our military might, but the smallest of God's creatures?" Well, that's what 12-year-old boys were looking for. We wanted to blast some aliens. So, any questions?
I don't have any questions.
I have,
I do have a couple ideas, and maybe you can. They're not going
sure.
to be very articulate, and maybe you can help me tie them and stitch them together.
Yeah.
But
I'm working on that in another part of the program too. I really am. And I talked with Ruben Hatio about the idea of countervailing influences to entropy. So yeah, because I want to make us like a web, where you a drum or something where you bounce a coin on it and it keeps vibrating. So I'm going to do that.
yeah, well, so my thought, Phil, is it's kind of a little bit weird, but you know how we've had this idea of the filter, and I'm probably a little bit overly fascinated with this filter where we have all this information coming at us.
Yeah.
Flooding us, and our conscious kind of decides it filters, takes a large amount of information, distills it,
Yeah.
changes stuff, throws some stuff out, manipulates other stuff, and it changes it to like give our, form our perception of what's happening in front of us, right? Well, it strikes me that what I kind of find interesting is that, so you're talking how you made social connections through science fiction and through chess. And it's kind of like, most people have a lot easier time making friends when they're kids compared to when they're adults, making like true lifelong friends, right?
Yeah.
And, if you think about it, like kids will play and you'll play with a friend and you'll make up some imaginary game.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of the same thing, like in science fiction or chess. It kind of, that information, you can choose to like filter that information a different way, and you don't have as many constraints as you do when you've kind of been programmed for a while, and you got to try to have this information fit what you think should be, whatever you kind of made for your model of the world. But when you free yourself from that, like if you have like like science fiction would use imagination, chess you have to use like imagination, like you and I can see the same have the same position put in front of us, but we're going to see different things, and they have different meanings. But we don't feel like whatever move we decide to play or however we interpret that position is bound by what we see as like Kathy was saying, like societal mores or rules or whatever, right? So maybe there's something to that, and I've always been kind of negative on like how we've had this, now we have this kind of like choose your own adventure lifestyle where YouTube or Google or whatever will present a different reality or present different information to me than it will to you based on our private search histories and everything like that. But maybe if people are kind of allowed to run, I mean, it's double-edged sword, but maybe if people are allowed to kind of run and kind of be presented with more information they want, and they can kind of have their imagination take part of that, maybe that could have some kind of, like you were saying, like some kind of reverse entropy effect or something like that. I know it's a little abstract and a little bizarre, but it strikes me that there could be some kind of connection there.
What's really weird, thinking about this, I called Ruben and left a voicemail message on his phone, and apparently I had told him that I had experienced kind of a transformation. The word for it is metayoina. I think that's the word for it. I'll look it up. But it means you change your mind about something. And he said, well, can you tell me about it? And I said, I got to think about it. I got to remember it. And I think that the change maybe isn't in the message that I left you, but in the phone call we're having now. It's crazy, but I mean, how much I hate to write. I mean, I hate it. I hate fixing things, and I hate giving it back, and I hate my audience. But so isn't that what you call a job?
Yeah, except you're not forced to do it. A job is when you have something you hate and you have to do it, and you have to do it with somebody you wouldn't choose to do it with, right?
Yeah. So keep going with this, then. What is this other thing that's not a... Oh, I know what it is. I think I know what it is. I have a friend named Richard Russell, who is the kind of a corporate genius, and was one of the founding members of the Madison Science Fiction Group. And another friend named John Oliger, who's passed away now, who was head of adult education for Ohio State. But they were talking about the difference between a professional and an amateur. And they said, well, the difference between a professional and an amateur might well be that the amateur is like a volunteer, and does it because he wants to, rather than be ordered to. And maybe you want to you well, so you it didn't work out. Maybe you tried to do something that didn't work out, but you got a chance to do it the way you wanted to, at least. You know, you don't have a boss. I don't have a boss. I mean, isn't it great not to have a boss?
Yeah, don't miss
And
it.
I I have I had to crawl under an industrial oven one time in order to pick up a ball of tinfoil that my boss had put down there, and I wanted to stuff them in the dumpster. Well, I'd be getting out of jail if I did now, but so yeah, maybe it makes it's strange because remember how I said philosophers get to live the I got to be careful here because there's wives listening, but we sort of do get to do pretty well with what we want, and maybe there's some imperative to reduce suffering. That's as best as I got now, you know, and but it's good enough.
Yeah, it's interesting because the kind of the friends you meet through chess are kind of different, aren't they?
Oh yeah. Well,
And I think there is something to that. Like you meet in a circumstance where imagination is involved, and there's not like you don't have to conform to certain beliefs. You're free to argue over a chess position, right?
yeah,
Like chess players will argue over a position, but they don't take personal offense, or there's not, they're not offending some belief of the other person, at least at a level that like causes permanent damage between them.
yeah, and yeah. I remember once with a Korean guy. I made a joke about a Go game, and I sort of jokingly, uh, apparently I accused him of cheating, and he said, I demand that we fight." I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "You're half my size, you know. I'm very sorry if I offended you, but we don't fight over stuff like this." Between chess and Go, think of like, my friend Richard Jensen sometimes watches these, and I've mentioned him before. He put me in touch with a number of German authors who framed some of my life experience. I saw some things that these guys had experienced, and I related it to it. And just a couple of days ago, I noticed not only did he graduate from Princeton in mathematics and get 2 doctorates after that, but he graduated summa cum laude, you know. And frankly, he was a smart, gracious guy, but he wasn't that much different. I loved talking to him about German literature, and sometimes even about some of the mathematical formulations. Maybe it's part of it is that we get tracked to do things. Somebody says, "Well, he would make a good blah, and we need blah blah blah," and so we need somebody that will do these $500,000 surgeries. And according to our profile, this guy would be the best one to do it, and maybe he doesn't want to.
Right. Right.
Yeah, who would want to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know.
Yeah, so it could be an interesting world when the robots start to free people up, huh?
Yeah. What do you? What's gonna happen?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think I don't know what's going to happen, but like, I think the more interesting thing is like, how do you get there? So my kind of like cynical interpretation is that they're like corporate America and whatever is trying to make the job so miserable that people welcome the robots. At least that's how I felt in pharmacy. Like you will welcome the robot just replacing you because they made it so miserable that people will welcome the robots and be like, "Hey, just give me some universal basic income and I'll live on half the money and just stay out of the way." But you know, that'll fly for some people and not other people, and it'll be really interesting to see how some kind of equilibrium is established there and without some kind of breakdown. But it'll work itself out. It always does.
There's that, isn't
it? Well, I mean, there's a lot of people that define themselves by their career, or you know, they don't have enough meaning outside of their career or whatever. I think those will be the people that you'll have going postal and shooting up places when they're replaced by the robot or whatever, right? So probably want to steer clear of certain environments, you know, during the transitory period, but afterwards it'll probably be pretty good because you'll have people that are kind of born into a system where they aren't, like you're saying, forced down a path that while they may be one of the better people that are suited to carry out those kind of responsibilities, they're not needed anymore. So they're freed up to actually use their, like the guy we were just talking about. Well, maybe he could have made some good contributions in the humanities or literature, but because he was a math genius, you know where you're going to get steered, right?
Yeah, he not only was he a math genius, but another one of my friends got way over his head. He was sort of okay in German. He had a German degree from someplace. So he got a job translating German philosophy, and he was just doing horrible with it. And my friend walked by him, looked over his shoulder, and read the page out loud. I thought, Jesus Christ, you know, pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Well, oh, you know, that world you were talking about. H.G. Wells, as I mentioned H.G. Wells before, and said he was sort of a scientist and a writer and an idea guy who imagined a disjunctive future, that the future that we would have would be different from the future we were living through. And again, this was at the time of the height of the British Empire, when you could sit at some tea shop and order anything by telephone any place in the world and get it pretty fast. But the way the world evolved for Wells in the Time Machine, and this was his first big novel, was that there were two kinds. There were the Eli and the Morlocks. The Morlocks were the industrial workers, and they lived down underground, and they turned out the stuff. And the Eli got to keep it, but they got everything, and they sort of didn't have to do anything, except that every once in a while the Morlocks would go and eat a few of them. They were like chickens or turkeys or something, you know, and and they made a pretty good movie of it too, The Time Machine. But I remember I stumbled on H.G. Wells. There was a bookshop on Johnson Street in Madison where I used to live, and I found his biography was called Experiment and Autobiography, and I started following him, and he had a huge effect on the English language because he had this idea that for him, language and literature had a social function, and that they would put questions in a format that we could understand them without being so totally deluged by information, you know, by unfiltered like a fire hose, that we could think and make decisions. And what he called it was the race between catastrophe and education. And he wanted a kind of education that was accessible to an informed public, and he looked for something like the internet, but with paper based because they hadn't thought of that yet. And Wells lived to see a little. He saw all of World War II and actually did some work on anti-submarine radar. But what he said about himself was he said if we had a brain contest, I'd probably be in the third class. But I'm an ordinary mind who lived in extraordinary times. I've even got a video of him up on my blog. And see, as we pull this up, it's like, like we're playing music or something, and somebody plays a note, and then I play a note, and maybe you start out and you're sort of down and dejected, and it's the blues, and the tempo then picks up, and you think, well, maybe there's something more to this music, and maybe there's something else, and maybe we don't have to play a dirge all the time.
Yeah. I
So,
hear you.
So that's where
Shendo here.
Yeah. Is that a uptake enough ending? Because I'm sort of I don't know how I realized it, but I got it pretty good here.
Yeah,
And it would be nice to make something pretty.
Well, I tell you, when I took that brief respite from trying to solve the world's problems, or not trying to solve the problems, but just absorbing myself, or not even absorbing myself, but just making myself aware of all the world's problems.
Yeah.
I just feel so energized taking a respite in my chest. I just been destroying. I beat a 1800 player in 14 moves this morning. Checkmated him in 14 moves. It's just some kind of it's liberating.
You know what I think? I'd like to do for a while. If you seriously, if you want to show me some games, that would be fine. I'm going to take a little break from chess and build up my strength, but I don't mind looking at the games at all.
Yeah. Well, should we wrap up our show there?
I think this is a good point to wrap up our show and maybe look at a couple chess games.
Yeah, I'll show you this crushing game I had this morning. Actually, I had two in the last 2 days. I had two miniatures where I checkmated them within 25 moves.
Huh. Yeah, sure.
Playing these unassuming openings, so it's kind of interesting. So, but anyway, let's sign off, huh?
Okay.
Thanks for joining us, Kathy.
Yep. Bye-bye.
We'll get Jan one of these times.